So I haven't really talked too much about what my actual plan is. The plan is to take this 22RE that's all blown up and busted out of Danny Bonaducci and replace it with a 4-liter engine that comes out of later model Tacoma and 4Runners. I'm going to start by taking out the wiring harness and disconnecting all the various hoses, things that are connected to it, and then we'll see if we can pull this engine out in one piece. But before I do all of that, I still haven't finished draining any of the fluids. Well, I got all the fuel out, but I still need to get everything else out. So I'm going to start draining fluids and then taking it apart.
It's so thick, it doesn't even look like it's moving. It's just like a stick.
That's what she
But
said.
it's moving. Once everything was finished draining, I started with the radiator by disconnecting the radiator hoses. The upper hose was held on by 2 spring clamps, and the lower hose was held on by 2 bolt-driven clamps. They were both pretty easy to get off, although I don't think that bottom hose had ever been taken off before because it was on there pretty good. I had to use a box knife to cut it a little bit. Once the hoses were removed, then I started by removing the bolts on the fan shroud first. The fan shroud has 2 bolts on either side, and the same thing with the radiator, 2 bolts on either side. So first I did the 4 bolts for the fan shroud, and then I did the 4 bolts for the radiator, and then pulled the radiator out. My next step in the process was to remove the accessory drive so that I could get the power steering pump off of the side of the engine. I was going to use a socket wrench to do this, but Gnob told me that this particular wrench would work better for the job, so I used it instead.
Well, you get fucking straight up and down, big time leverage on it. Pull it straight.
Oh, that's so much better.
Yeah.
It's already pretty loose.
Yeah. Well, if you want to loosen it up way further than you think you need to, because that's how you get the belt off there.
Once that power steering belt is pulled out of the way, you can remove the 4 bolts holding the pump to the bracket, 2 in the front tucked kind of behind the pulley, and then 2 in the rear. All that is kind of underneath that distributor, so if need be, pull the cap and wires out of the way to show you the bolts.
I forgot how awesome ratcheting wrenches are.
Yeah.
Once I finished getting the power steering pump out of the way, I moved over to the other side of the engine compartment and did the same thing with the AC compressor. Similar situation, the AC compressor is held on by 4 bolts, and I also had to disconnect the clutch wire. If Danny Bonaducci had had a battery, this would be the point where I would disconnect it because now I'm going to take out the starter. The starter was held on with a nut on the top and a bolt on the bottom. I was able to get to the nut from the top, but I had to get to the lower bolt through the wheel well. This would be a good opportunity to disconnect the fuel filter from the high pressure fuel line, along with the transmission harness plug. I also had to disconnect the solenoid lead and the battery lead from the starter.
Alright, so the starter is out.
I mean, not technically. It's still sitting there. Okay, now the starter is out.
Alright.
Gonna take a break for a second. Recap what I've done so far. I drained the radiator and the oil pan, the transmission, and the transfer case. That was everything, right? Yeah. Then I took the radiator out, took the shroud off the fan. I pulled the AC compressor out of the way, and I did the same thing with the power steering pump on the other side. I got rid of some hoses, disconnected a bunch of other random hoses, like the transmission coolant lines had to come off of there, throttle cables, I took the starter out. I still need to disconnect the wiring harness and then do the bolts on the bell housing and the transfer case. And I think that'll be it, but so far so good.
Let's have little hooks that hook into the.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
All right.
So just unplug those 2 yellow plugs and the 3 plugs from the computer. Did you get both the yellow? Get that white?
Please.
That one.
After the engine harness was all pulled out and tucked away, the next step is to move on to the torque converter bolts. Free up to 6 of those bolts. It's handy to have an extra hand to turn the crank while the other person loosens and removes those bolts. Once those are all out of the way, go ahead and move on to the bell housing bolts. And you got the 4 stiffener bolts at the bottom, and then there's 6 bell housing bolts. A couple of them are reachable from the top. If you can't reach them from the top, you can get after them with a long extension and a swivel. Work those out, and then it's time to pull the motor out.
Oh my god, I'm lifting myself up in the air. Nothing's happening.
It has been a long, dirty day, but look at that. It's out. Yeah, I still gotta get the transmission out, but whatever, that's only gonna take a second.
This would be the point where you would see excellent footage of me removing both the front and rear drive lines, along with disconnecting the transmission linkages. Apparently that was too boring to watch, so this is what Gnob did instead. All I can show you is where the drive lines used to be connected, along with the 8 bolts that I had to remove to get the crossmember off of the frame.
Okay, I think that's plenty for the day. Got the engine out, got the tranny out. Yeah.
That wraps up another episode of Snale Racing.
Thank you for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe.